Vice Media was once one of the hottest names in new media. They've just filed for bankruptcy protection ahead of a proposed deal to sell off to a consortium of lenders. It's an extraordinary collapse. Just a few years ago, they had a multi-billion-dollar valuation as investors looked to this swashbuckling approach to news and the young audiences it was attracting. But of late, these groups have found it hard going. Last month, BuzzFeed cut its award-winning news operation, and Vox is now laying off staff across its business. It's part what down to the competition coming from the traditional media groups, but it's also the tight grip that groups like Meta have on digital advertising. Benjamin Mullin, media reporter for the New York Times, gave us his reaction to the news.
One of the really interesting things about Vice, to your point, is that it's had so many different lives. It started out as a punk magazine in Montreal, and then sort of changed a little bit to become a digital media brand with a TV channel. And then I would say sort of like its most recent iteration is sort of this sprawling global company with offices all around the world. So it's really reinvented itself over the course of several decades. So what's happening is what's called a bankruptcy sale. So the company has filed for bankruptcy. It's running a 363 process, which basically means the company has a stalking horse bidder. So a company has agreed to acquire Vice for $225 million, which is quite a haircut compared to its, at your point, $6 billion valuation. And that sale process is going to go on for the next 55 days or so. So if a bidder comes in and says, we actually think Vice is worth more than $225 million, that initial bidder would be outbid.
Chris Morris, I remember when Vice News came onto the scene. For me, it was probably Crimea in 2013-14, and they really did push the boundaries. They were sort of fearless in their reporting. They were gun and run. They were on DSLR cameras. It brought this whole new way of approaching a subject and really challenge what we do. So why are they not successful?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, not just Vice. You mentioned BuzzFeed before. Similarly, if they just felt much more fresh than many of the traditional media that you and I were appearing on. It was a new approach. It just felt different. I mean, for example, Vice brought back the idea of, longer form foreign coverage into TV news when it appeared to be going out of fashion. Why have they not been successful? I think you've already said it. It just shows how hard it is to make progress in the world of digital publishing, where especially when you have the big tech companies creaming off all the advertising revenue. These companies tried different things. You heard that Vice kept reinventing itself, but in the end it simply wasn't making enough money to survive. This
is it, Joel, isn't it? We're at sort of saturation point at the moment with new media, and it's, I mean, even Elon Musk at Twitter is finding the same issue. How do you monetize what is a very successful product?
I remember back in the tech boom in the late 90s when all these companies were making money hand over fist, or so we thought, and then overnight, poof, they disappeared and collapsed. And it has a reminiscent feel to that right now, where the search for dollars, the search for converting eyeballs into cash is still a goal that is very elusive. And, of course, after the tech crash a few years later, Facebook and Google come out of nowhere. They begin to grow. Now they dominate the landscape. Who knows what's going to happen next? People love their media, love their social media, love their information, love gathering the news from all different sources. But it does seem like an incredibly difficult space to make dollars in. And we're going to be worse off without Vice and without BuzzFeed and their kinds of integration of scoops and new media and real classic journalism. That it's going to be a bit less interesting to read the news for at least the near term.
Do you think, Chris, it's, I mean, you were formerly of this parish, so you know how we've sort of evolved and where traditional media organisations are going. I just wonder if they've caught up, because we used to invite Vice News to meetings here and they would talk to us about what they do, but clearly the traditional broadcasters are evolving into the space that was occupied by new media.
They are to some extent, yeah, and I think it's harder to make money in journalism, full stop. There's less money in journalism, full stop, and that is partly because the social media revolution means that everyone can broadcast to anyone around the world simply by switching on their mobile phone, and so you've got to be pretty good to cut through the noise. There's so much information out there, and I think the danger is that the good stuff sometimes gets lost. Definitely those new companies like Vice a decade or so ago were offering something differently, but But I think you're right that the bigger, more traditional, better funded organizations, whether it be the BBC here, the big networks in the US and so on, they moved on to that territory, and they're trying to experiment now with looking a bit more relevant to the way they think their audiences are developing.
A view from David Folkenklick. He's the NPR media correspondent. We had a bit of a problem getting hold of you, David, but you're there now. I don't know if you were listening in on a discussion, but I mean, there is a hope that the sale will give the company a new lease of life, but it seems to me it's going to have to be a very different company.
Oh, it's going to certainly be a humbled one internally, and it's going to have a much smaller footprint. I mean, this was a company that had operated with braggadocio and real a kind of swagger, but also infused with just an enormous amount of money, as I'm sure your other guests have mentioned, from the likes of Disney, of James Murdoch, and separately of Fox Corp now, and of other major investors less well known to your audience, but nonetheless certainly well-heeled. And without that money to just sort of experiment and try and spend, they're not going to be able to span the world in the way that they once were. They did very ambitious work. They were at once deeply irresponsible in certain chapters of their existence, at the same time doing some wonderful reporting, intrepid investigating of what happened away from people's gaze. You think back to the Charlottesville riots, racist riots in Virginia, 2017, I believe it was, maybe a bit later. And, they had reporters really going in with those some of those figures in that movement to explain not only the hatred, but the organizing and the focus that was brought to bear to make that come to life. I have a lot that I admire about Vice, even as they approached the world in a very different way than your news organization and mine.
Yeah, no, I think all journalists had a lot of admiration for them. But, we were just saying, you've got Vice that have gone, BuzzFeed's gone, Vox are cutting, Paramount Media called time on MTV News. Don't we want these brands? And shouldn't we not be asking about who controls digital advertising? I mean, can we just have digital advertising in the hands of Google and Meta, or do we need to find a better way to fund these organizations?
I kind of want to check all of the above. Like, I don't feel there should be only any one path at the moment. The sad thing is, I don't think there's any clear-cut cookie-cutter path that a bunch of digital entrepreneurs can point to and say, we can make money doing high-quality news with an interesting voice in this way in the digital space. It's not clear to me. I mean, Vox, which was in some ways the least sexy of the bunch, is still ambling along gently, but it's much more contained and restrained ambitions. They also acquired New York Magazine, which is both a print publication and a brand, but also has a suite of digital verticals off that. But it's been much more tempered and careful with how it's spent its money and how it's gone about things. And I think that's a lesson as well. But to think, Jill Abramson, the former New York Times editor-in-chief or executive editor, wrote a book called Merchants of Truth, in which she chronicled both the rise of Vice and BuzzFeed, but also the progress of some older mainstream news organizations. And it turns out the New York Times, her old shop, is more indispensable than those digital disruptors which promise to shake up the game and tell the New York Times how it should be played. Actually, the New York Times has taken lessons from them, but it's now exceeded 10 million paid digital total subscribers, and it's focusing on 15, maybe 20 million ultimately in just a few years to come. So the funny thing is, I want there to be all of the above. I'd love MTV News, which I remember from my youth, to have survived, but I'm not saying any one brand has to endure. I just want there to be a vast choice for people to draw upon.
Yeah, evolving into their space. That's the power of the big companies, isn't it? David Folkenklick, good to talk to you always. Thank you very much.